Welcome to Behind the Line, the podcast where you'll get untold stories from first responders and military veterans. I'm Tim Hagman. I'll be your host. My guest today grew up in the small town of Mascoutah, Illinois, which is located in the south central part of the state. She lives an active life and enjoys sewing, cooking, golf, traveling, playing guitar, yoga, photography, and being a grandparent. She also has a passion to write and has written and published 2 books. She served in the United States Army from 1967 to 1970. Of the 10,000 women who served in the Vietnam War, 7,000 were nurses, also known as Angels of Mercy. And my guest for this episode was one of them. Please join me in welcoming Lou Eisenbrandt. Lou, welcome to the Behind the Line podcast.
It's nice to be here. Thank you, Tim.
Well, I'm glad you made it. I'm glad we were able to connect. I know you've been busy. In fact, you just got back from a trip overseas. Is that correct?
Did, and actually, I guess you wouldn't say overseas. The last trip we did was to Canada, so there's
Oh,
no seas between us. But yes, we were visiting our son and his wife live in Canada, in
oh.
British Columbia. So we
Well,
escaped some of the heat of the Kansas and went up to British Columbia.
I've never been, but I heard it's beautiful.
It is. It's lovely, and especially in July, it's a good place to be.
Well, I'm glad you had a good time, got to spend some family time together, and now you're
Yes,
back here. So thank you for taking the
we
time
are.
to be on the podcast.
Sure.
So with that, let's go ahead and just jump right into it and get started. All right?
Okay.
All right. So tell me, why did you join the Army and how old were you when you joined?
At the time that I was in nurses training, and I graduated in 1968, so this would have been 1967, there was a program through the Army that you could sign on and they would pay you a salary your senior year of nurses training. You completed school, took your state boards, and then you owed Uncle Sam 2 years of active duty. And growing up in a small town, the oldest of 5, not a lot of extra funds for travel. We were also near an Air Force base, and a lot of my friends were Air Force brats. Their dads had been everywhere, and I thought this was my chance to see the world, to get some funds to repay my parents. And so that's why I joined. I was actually, when I signed on the line, I was actually under 21 because my parents had to sign as well. And then I turned 21 shortly thereafter.
Wow. Okay. All right. So you joined the Army. You plan on travel, see parts of the world. Um, but you had to go before that happened. I'm assuming you had to go through boot camp. Is that correct?
Yes, it was called Officers Basic Training. Um,
Where where was that held?
it was at Fort Sam Houston, Texas, which was I think pretty much everyone who was in the Army Nurse Corps took their basic training at Fort Sam.
And how long was the boot camp, the training?
It was basically 6 weeks. Um, a little bit of, I guess I'd say a little bit of everything. We did some what they called in the old days bivouac out, overnight one. Learned how to bandage. Of course, I had I just been going as a nurse with the little training that they gave me, I think I would not have done as well. But fortunately, I had lots of practice during the course of my education. But there, it really was an awakening just to learn the ways of the Army, because some nurses that I know of who went to Vietnam went straight from their officer's basic to Vietnam. I'm glad I had 9 months at Fort Dix in between because it gave me a feel for what the Army was like, and it helped a lot in my adjustment to Vietnam.
Yeah, I'm sure it did, especially getting to know a little bit about the culture of the Army, the military, before you went over to Vietnam. I'm sure that helped.
Yes, and I particularly noticed it, as an officer when I was at Walson Army Hospital in Fort Dix. Even though there was a nurse who had been there for 40 years, she was civilian and I was military. So I was technically in charge, but you don't come in and say, well, now that I'm in charge, we're going to do it this way. Because she was at that point was a much better nurse and
Mm.
certainly knew the ropes better than I did. So you learn to how to ease into a new situation and not be sounding like a bully.
Yes, I get that. So when you joined the army, did you have any idea, or did you know that you would end up in Vietnam?
Well, I guess I should have been smarter and assumed there was a war going on. There was a good chance I was going to get sent over there. But, when you're 21, the world is yours to be had. And I guess I just figured, well, I would do whatever came my direction. My mother always told us that whatever you decide to do it 100%. And I never really went in with a fear that something was going to happen to me. And certainly if Vietnam was not on my list of places to see the world, but can't get much more exotic and distance wise far away from home.
Yes, I can only imagine. Joining for one reason, even though you knew what was going on there, not expecting, and there's at some point you're told, Lou, you're going to go to Vietnam. What was that like, and how'd you find out about that?
I found out in a very interesting way. My first duty assignment, as I said, was Fort Dix, and I had to be there the first of the year 1969, and I was at Fort Dix for 9 months when I got a Manila envelope in the mail that said, "Congratulations, you're going to Vietnam."
Oh,
Uh, I'm not I'm not sure that we celebrated at that time, but um, I do know that the first roommate I had at Fort Dix, she had gotten orders about 6 months before I did. So I think when she got orders is when it hit me that I might be joining her and doing the same thing.
wow. And once you received your orders, how soon did you go to Vietnam? Get to Vietnam?
As I recall, I got orders and it took a month of leave. I think it
Mm.
was the month of September, and went home, kind of left my car behind, which I think, as I recall, my father sold for me while I was in Vietnam.
Mm.
And so I took a month's leave, and then I had to be. I know exactly when I went to Vietnam because I lost Halloween going across the international date line. So
Oh,
October of '69, and I lost October 31st, and landed in Vietnam on the 1st of November.
so November in Vietnam, what was it like when you exited the plane? What I mean, I've heard stories of just the heat and a few other descriptions. How was it for you in November when you stepped off the plane?
Well, if you think about it, first of all, November, end of October back home, it's pretty pleasant. It's kind of nice. And the first thing I noticed when I stepped off the plane in Benoit Airport was, to quote Robin Williams from his Good Morning Vietnam, it was hot, damn hot. And it
Yes.
was. And of course, those are back in the days. There were no walkways. They pushed the ladder up there, and you had to walk out, and it was just like getting hit with a wet blanket. And there are certain smells. I think in general in any country that you visit that you retain the smell, and so between the heat and the whatever the smell was, it was pretty made a really good impression on me.
Wow. And a lasting one,
Lasting, no doubt, no
I'm
doubt.
sure. So now you're in Vietnam. What was your first assignment?
After I First thing they did was said, "Where do you want to go?" Well, I didn't know where I wanted to go. I'd never been to Vietnam before. I didn't know if there were good hotels in a certain place. I mean, what do you do when you're in a war zone? I chose Chu Lai because the roommate I talked about was assigned to the 91st Evac in Chu Lai. And so when that was a possibility, I thought, well, at least I know one person. So I requested Chu Lai. Fortunately, that is the assignment that I got. And well, of course, they lost my luggage, which is, I guess, still happening today. It doesn't
Oh,
make
yeah.
any difference where you're going. Um, but my first duty assignment for the first 3 months I was there, I was in a medical ward. Um, Basically, that meant guys who were in the hospital for anything not related to a wound of some sort. So in Vietnam, malaria was a big issue with
Mm.
mosquitoes and lots of water pools and things of that sort. So malaria, hepatitis from eating dirty, contaminated food. The guys would just eat whatever they could get their hands on. Um, Parasites, intestinal parasites, again, from not eating good stuff. Um, I think the biggest thing we saw that wasn't related to an injury directly was uh, sores that you get on your feet if you wear your um, boots, your combat boots, for days on end. They get wet. You can't dry them out, and then you start rubbing the sides of your legs, and we called it jungle rot.
Mm.
And basically, then the sores get infected, and it can be quite painful. So we saw a lot of jungle rot along with the intestinal issues. I even had a colonel who I had a heart attack, and I took care of him. So anything that wasn't directly related to weapons.
Okay, got it. It's kind of a oh, I instead of being right into an emergency room, working the ward, getting for you and the other nurses getting used to the environment, I'm sure. And then after that time, where did you go after that?
After I was there for 3 months, I was asked by the chief nurse if I wanted to accept the challenge of the emergency room. Um, and so I accepted and spent the remaining almost 9 months working in the emergency room, where we would get guys directly from the field. Some of them came in uh, and maybe with an IV started, or at least some bandages if it was like a sucking chest wound or something of that sort. But most of them uh, didn't have a whole lot of treatment before they came to our hospital.
So that was just obviously from 3 months working the ward, going to the emergency room, the guys coming in straight from, the field, to be dealt with.
Right.
What was your typical day like? And how many days a week did you work? Did you have a schedule, or what was it like for you in the emergency ward there?
The general schedule for all of the nurses was 12 hours shifts, 12 hours on, 12 hours off, 6 days a week. And occasionally, if we had a little, like particularly with the emergency room, if we had a little downtime, we would get a 2 hour break um, in the morning or in the afternoon, depending on where the lower uh, count of bodies coming in happened. But generally, if you worked in the emergency room, you heard two choppers or more come in, you automatically dropped what you were doing and went to the emergency room, because it usually meant at least two casualties, generally four, maybe six, and certainly greater numbers than that. So wherever you were, you came, um, and hopefully you didn't get enough casualties that you needed to call in people who weren't just worked like the night before.
Mm.
But that was generally the pattern, was wherever you were, you came in.
Was there in your time, the 9 months there, were there any injuries that were um, more common than others?
Well, I think probably the most common was shrapnel, because when you blow something up, you're going to be left with little bits of steel, wood, whatever. And depending on where the shrapnel hit, if you hit you in your backside, it wasn't such a big deal. But if it hit in your neck where your major vessels were, you could die within 5 minutes of loss of blood. Um, and then and sometimes those shrapnel injuries were hard to judge because I'm certain there are still guys walking around today that had little pieces embedded that they uh, never were removed.
Hmm.
But um, lots of casualties due to stepping on landmines and things of that sort, punji pits, all of those generally resulted in an amputation. So we would see guys come in with either one leg missing or both legs, even a triple amputee a few times. Um, the other things were gunshot wounds, obviously. When we'd get in a gunshot wound uh, victim, we did this with all the patients. First thing we did was roll them over because you can't judge by looking at the front side of the body what's happening on the back side. And so the first thing we did was cut off clothes. There was no privacy
Hmm.
in a emergency room in a combat zone. So we would cut off the clothes and then we would if they were on a litter, we'd roll them over to see what what things were looking like on the back. And I remember one young man who, when we rolled him over, his back essentially stayed on the gurney. And so we put him back down, prepped him for surgery, and he actually lived at least to be evac out to Tokyo. I think about him very often as I speak about my time there. I don't know if he survived or if his name is on the wall. I just don't know. But certainly gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, amputee, and sometimes the amputees would come in with a leg that was missing, but they'd bring the leg with it,
Hmm.
which still had a boot on it. Unfortunately, there was not much we could do about that situation. I think that the toughest part were head injuries, severe injuries. And oftentimes, when we did our triage, we simply, the docs would determine that there was no chance of survival for this young man. And one of the nurses would sit and hold their hand until they died, um, because there were limited amounts of uh, treatments that we could do in some cases. So those were the main thing, and then there were smaller injuries and things that came along, but those were the big things that we saw.
Yeah, you know, I can't imagine experiencing that anytime, but as a young woman, at your age to experience that, and then the other nurses as well, obviously doing your damnedest to save a soldier um, from their horrific injuries, and then there's the you just talked about those that you were told weren't going to make it. And the fact that a nurse would um, spend time with that soldier holding his hand until he passed, that's amazing. I never knew that. And I've done a lot of reading on just war and Vietnam. Um, uh,
Well, it's there were I often they have all I've always learned that the hearing is one of the last senses to go when death is near. And um, since I wrote my book, I actually heard from two women who said to me, my husband was in that situation where they thought he was not going to live. And he ended up, after they cared for those that they knew had a good chance, then they, took another look at some of the other more seriously wounded. And these two women said their husbands actually were in that situation where they remember the nurse talking to them and saying, you're going to be all right, you're going to be okay, that sort of thing, and that it made a huge difference in their life. So I feel good that even in those dire situations, we were hopefully able to bring some peace to the soldiers.
Um, yeah, I, definitely. I'm assuming you were one of those nurses who did that probably several times or at least once.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. It was. I would say we probably would like to have been able to do it more often. It just depended on how many wounded had come in and where we were needed in those situations. But it was not an uncommon thing that, y- you know, Vietnam was not a war zone, is not a place to say to somebody, you're not going to make it.
Mm.
You say, you lie through your teeth if you need to and say, you're going to be fine. You're going to be okay. But I will tell you, I noticed more than anything in those situations that it was the other guys in the platoon or the um, whatever group was there. They were concerned about their buddies. I can still hear them lying on the uh, litter and saying, "How's Joe?
Mm.
How's he gonna do? Is he gonna be okay?" And of course, you say he's gonna be okay. You can't. It doesn't come with a guarantee. But we tried the best that we could to make him okay. But they were always concerned about their buddies.
Um, if I'm just now thinking this, with what you experienced doing that and having a soldier pass away while you're with him, holding his hand, was there a common theme, or if they were able to speak, that they would reflect on or talk about as they were slowly dying?
In general, I would say things that the guys thought about, whether they were dying or just badly wounded, was their mothers, their girlfriends,
Mm.
their wives, uh, fiancés, um, sometimes just generally things in life. Um, Obviously, many of them were very concerned about uh, injuries to the groin area because they wanted to, will my girlfriend still want to be interested in me when I get back? Um, and there were times they would say to us, "You remind me of my whatever girlfriend or sister or somebody."
Mm.
Um, so again, their biggest concerns, I think, were family and buddies. And you did the best you could to um, cheer them up is probably not a good terminology, but to reassure them.
Yes. Um, and unfortunately, I'm sure you had to do that many, many times. Um,
Way more times. Sorry, way more times than I would like to have done.
so you just mentioned the one kid that you said you think about all the time. Is there another incident that you would be willing to share with us that I'm now I know there's many that you think about often, but is there, besides the one you just talked about, is there another soldier or just another incident that happened or something you witnessed that is at the forefront of your mind often that you think about?
Yeah, there are several. Uh, in general, my frustration when I visit the wall in DC, and I was just there in May, and actually have an opportunity to go back again, and we'll be going back again in September. Um, I I always look at all the names and wonder how many of those guys and I
Hmm.
crossed, paths, because there was no way to keep track of names and, that sort of thing. So you would just do the best you could for them and then hope that they made it. But there was a guy who was a infantry officer, and he and I were struck up a friendship for the 4 days we were down in Long Bed before we were assigned, and he was assigned to the Americal division, which was very close to uh, uh, in Chulai, very close to where the hospital was. And we talked and kind of said, "See you around" when we got to our duty assignment. And he came in a couple months later with some of his guys who'd been wounded, um, just to make sure they were okay. Spent a couple days, and then about 2 months after that, he came back in and he was wounded.
Hmm.
And I was not assigned to his litter, but the nurse who was said to me as they took him into the ER, he may lose both of his legs. And that's the only time that I had to actually walk out of the ER and recompose myself, mainly because I felt like I knew him.
Mhm.
Um, and I did actually follow up when he came back and was assigned to Fort Benning, Georgia. And after I got back from Vietnam, I actually went down and visited him for a couple days. And he still had his legs, but they were not very useful to him. And I think about him often and wonder whatever happened to him.
So, so you've lost contact with him.
Yes, I did actually look up his name because it was very unusual and I won't share it. And I did find someone with that name, so he may still be living. I don't know. You mixed feelings about recontacting old people.
I understand. I understand. Um, but wow, that's amazing that at least, unfortunately his legs are not were not useful or in the best condition, but he was able to save to save
Yeah.
those. Um, so you were in Vietnam for 12 months,
Yes.
and obviously you had friends or, coworkers.
Mhm.
Um, do you maintain relationships or friendships with any of them, or
I have with a couple. Um, One of the gals who we struck up a friendship in Vietnam, and when we got back, she came back a couple months ahead of me, and we decided before we left Vietnam we were going to do a driving tour. We took 6 weeks, left out of her home in Minneapolis, and took well, not the family car, but an old car, and drove all over the Northwest. Now this was in November, so there was snow in Yellowstone. We went to started out at um, yes, the Four Presidents.
oh, got it. Yep, got it.
Um, and then we drove all the way up to Seattle and then down the coast. And every place we stopped, we stayed with nurses that had been our um, friends in Vietnam.
Oh,
Mount Rushmore,
oh
senior
yes.
moment here. And then we ended up in Vegas, and when we got to Denver, we applied for civil service nursing jobs at Fitzsimmons Army Hospital since we were both out of the military at that point. And then came on home, and then 2 months later moved to Denver. I think that was very helpful for us to reassess and to um, return to society because the coming back was was not happy for a lot of people. And I think that helped ease our recovery from Vietnam. So Becky and I still, and she was in our wedding, and so we still
Oh,
stay
wow.
in contact. And thanks to, um, excuse me, Facebook, um, I have now located 4 other women who were nurses in Vietnam. Um, so it's Facebook has its issues, but for things like that, it's been nice to reconnect with some of the people that I knew there.
Yes. Well, that's an awesome story that you were able to take that road trip and then reconnect. And I understand what you say about Facebook, but it is a great resource if,
Yeah,
friends and, to see if you can reconnect with somebody you served with, maybe went to college with. So I'm glad you were able to do that.
yeah.
Has any soldiers ever tried to, or any soldiers ever reached out to you, wanted to find, somebody who helped them? Has anybody reached out to you?
Oh, yeah. I wouldn't say a lot, but I would say a handful of guys who have read my book and um, got an email and sent me an email and said, you know, you may have been at the hospital when I was there.
Mm.
Um, I would say there are only a couple that, and our paths didn't cross while we were there, but we were there, same place, same time. So, and I still occasionally get somebody, um, who, like I said, thinks, well, maybe I was there. I was in the hospital for malaria at the same time you were. And um, so what's a challenge is people will say, oh, I have a friend who was in Vietnam. Maybe you know her.
Oh, right. Yes.
It's
Yes.
kind of like I have a friend in New York. Maybe you know her.
I get that. I know, and being in law enforcement, I was sharing with you, for 33 years, it's a huge community.
Oh, yeah.
And, "Oh, do you know so and so?" I'm like, "No, I'm sorry." It's big, but,
Yeah.
I understand what you mean.
Right.
Um, so, um, I wanna get into, like, I wanna go kinda jump ahead and
Okay.
then, go back to, something. But we talked before, and, you were diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, a little over 20 years ago. Is that correct?
Yes. 22 years ago.
22 years ago. And how'd that come about? I mean, I read in an article about that, about Agent Orange and being involved. But if you can talk about that, um, and what happened back when you were in Vietnam, and then what happened 22 years ago.
Okay. Um, yes, I was diagnosed, have had symptoms for 22 years. And when I was first diagnosed, I remember saying to the neurologist, why? I don't have any relatives that I can put my finger on that had symptoms. And she said to me, well, the first, of course, is we look at heredity, but obviously that's not an issue with you. And then she said, there are chemicals like herbicides and pesticides that can cause, or we think can cause uh, Parkinson's. And I did not think about Vietnam at all. I said to her, oh my gosh, I'm an avid gardener. I dust my roses. I spray things, to kill pesticide. I kill pests. And she said, no, Lou, we're talking big. And she did this with her arm. She said, there are a lot of farmers that have Parkinson's. And of course, we're hearing more and more about that these days now, in the news. But didn't I didn't make a connection. And about 8 years later, I was cruising on the internet and stumbled on a report that said, if you are living with Parkinson's and believe you were exposed to Agent Orange,
Mm.
you may file a claim with the VA. And suddenly the light bulb went on. And I said, I didn't even think about it, but that made perfectly good sense. And people say to me, well, how do you know you were exposed to Agent Orange? And I said, well, first of all, they sprayed it everywhere in Vietnam. As a matter of fact, after my book was written, I came across a paper that literally lists a schedule for the areas that they were spraying with Agent Orange.
Hmm.
I mean, it's, we'll be in the Da Nang area on such and such a day. And I couldn't believe it. I would have included it had I gotten it before my book went to being published. And the other thing is, every guy that came in wounded, we cut off the clothes. Well, if it's got Agent Orange on it, somebody's going to be affected by that. So I did file a claim with the VA and it was accepted. And so I do get a little stipend every month from the VA. But the number of illnesses and conditions that now qualify for filing a claim has grown dramatically since I first filed 10, 18 years, 12 years ago. Yeah, it was a matter of knowing what I do now about Parkinson's. It's not something that when you have the first symptom, like maybe you're a tremor in your pinky finger, you're already well into the disease.
Oh,
So for the first years that you have it, you generally don't have any symptoms. And that's the tragedy of Parkinson's. And there's still much. I'm very involved with the Parkinson's Foundation, who is very active in research and doing things to help people who are living with Parkinson's live a better life, because there are so many symptoms. And so that's actually what brought me to write my second book, Unsteady as She Goes, about battling Parkinson's for 20 years. So fortunately, I was a pack rat and have always been. And so when I had to file a claim, you have to go through a lot of paperwork. And fortunately, I had all of that to back me up.
wow. Okay. Well, thank you for explaining that to us.
There's and the other thing is, which I think is hard for people to believe, but each individual with Parkinson's is an individual with Parkinson's. The symptoms, there are probably 12 symptoms that are pretty standard throughout, but everybody's different. And some of the things that some people struggle with, whether it's movement, my issue right now is balance. And I really, I've taken several falls, broken nose and chips of teeth and a few other things. But everybody has issues and they're not all the same. So that's also what makes it a challenge to treat.
That's interesting. Well, thank you again for sharing that with us.
My pleasure.
So, going back, you're in Vietnam, and now, how did you find out you were coming home? Were you notified verbally or in a letter? Was it a congratulations letter again, or?
I don't think it was congratulations at all. I think we felt we had made it through the year and we were happy for that. But when you get there, you start a short timers calendar, 365 days out from when you're supposed to go home. So I still have my calendar with my days X'd off.
Oh, wow.
And there, I guess it was just, I knew my time was getting short, and then they cut orders. And so somebody comes and says, you're going home.
Wow.
And you stew because it's been your life for a year. but you're glad you survived
Yes. Did you, with your calendar, did you mark it every day?
every
Or
day.
every day? Wow. So your time is up in Vietnam. You're grateful to be alive. Obviously, I'm not sure if you felt it at the time. I don't know, but at some point, you know, felt proud of what you did for the soldiers while you're in Vietnam. What was it like when you came home? Was
Hmm.
it how was your welcoming? Did somebody meet you? How was it when you arrived home?
Um, do you know the irony of all of this is what I remember of coming home. Um, I remember flying on Flying Tigers. It was a cargo uh, airline, and it was repositioned for uh, soldiers. When I went over to Vietnam, I flew American Airlines, and there were 13 women. When I came back, I was the only woman on the plane.
Hmm.
Um, and the minute our wheels touched off or went off the tarmac, a cheer went up from the whole plane, as I recall. Um, and there are a lot of guys that came back, and I say guys because it was mostly men. Um, did not get a warm welcome. Let's just put it that way. Um, I what I remember of coming home was I flew into SeaTac in Seattle um, airport and processed out, which is a couple days of paper signing and whatever else. Um, and then catching another plane to get back to flew into St. Louis, which was the nearest airport for my home in Illinois. Um, I don't remember being harassed.
Hmm.
A lot of the guys were spit upon, made fun of, called baby killers, and I have friends who were in that situation. I think I don't know whether people were kinder to women. I know women who did suffer from those what arrows of outrageous fortune or whatever they call. But I didn't necessarily feel that I was being singled out. And when I got to my hometown, it was a little different. The guys that came back and were going back to college campuses, I think, had the biggest struggle.
Hmm.
But when I came back, I went back to this small town. I was the only woman who'd ever gone off to war in my town. And I think my father was kind of proud of me for doing that. Um, and I don't really remember a lot of talk about um, what was it like. And I think that was a big issue too. People who were left behind didn't know what it was about, what we did, and they weren't particularly interested.
Hmm.
Um, I think for a lot of the guys who came back, that was an issue. Nobody cared because the war, by the time I came back, was not going well. Well, it's not going well before that, but I think people it just wasn't talked about.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, I've heard many stories, obviously, for years. Watched videos, movies, read articles, books about how the
Hmm.
soldiers were treated when they came home. Interviewed a few for this podcast that expressed or explained what they experienced when they came home. Um, so now that you're, which I think is, I mean, I don't understand. I mean, just don't understand how they could be treated that way. Even if you disagreed with what the war, maybe with what they were doing or did, shouldn't treat them the way they were treated, which is sad.
Don't take it out on the veterans.
Correct. I
Most of
agree.
them, many of them didn't volunteer. They they were drafted, and the blame was not should not have been on the veterans.
I agree. I agree. So now that you're now back in the United States, and then eventually you are discharged from the Army, how was adjustment for you after a year in Vietnam, being exposed to everything you were exposed to, everything you witnessed, the work you did? Um, how did you adjust when you came back?
Well, I think everybody goes through a little what I would call PTSD, but it's just loud noises, things of that sort, uh, frighten. And many guys live with that through for the rest of their life, as well as some nurses do. Um, like I said, I think that 6-week driving trip made a big difference for us. We were visiting with people who had been there, and so we could talk about it and not and we were interested from each other. And also connecting with people who came back. Um, some of them left friends behind. I say it's difficult. You've been so close to these people for a year that I think that was a big challenge too. For some more so than for others. Um, and you just, I didn't, I worked at the hospital in Fitzsimmons for about 6 months and then met my husband who was in the reserves and his 6 weeks, his 2 weeks of summer camp, as they called it, was at Fitzsimmons Army Hospital. And we met and dated every night for a week. And he proposed and we were married 3 months later. So that was a quick adjustment, I guess, on my part. That's not true for everybody, and many. I do know there were a lot of nurses who, like me, did not go back to a full time of working um, in a ward situation in a hospital, just because it's so intense in Vietnam. It was challenging to get back to the usual form of nursing.
I can imagine. Um, have you been back to Vietnam since?
4 times.
And
I went
and
back in 1994, 96, 2013, and 2014.
and um, how was that experience? Are those experiences? And did you go to any places where you were deployed that we talked about early on in the podcast?
Um, yes, the last trip, well, actually, yeah, actually, the last trip is the only one that I got to where exactly the hospital had been. Well, I should say that two of them. 1996, we went to where the hospital had been, but it was gone. We knew that.
Mm.
And then when I went in 2014, it was with a group of students, 12 students and 12 vets um, through the College of the Ozarks. And we tried to get as close to where we vets had spent our time. In my case, it was the young man who was partnered with me. We have a picture of us standing in front of a sign that says "Coming soon, Airport and Chulot." So that's no, there was nothing. There were no remnants left from the war.
Wow.
But I just had to go back because it's a beautiful country, and I just really felt I needed to go back.
Do you think I mean, was it a sense of healing at all? I mean, to go back?
I think the first one to visit back was to some degree. Um, and the last time I went back, I was with these other vets, and most of them had not gone back before. So I kind of felt like a mother figure, kind of keeping an eye on them and seeing how they reacted.
Wow. Okay. Um, well, I'm glad you got those opportunities to go back
Yeah, I am too.
at a different, obviously a different time than what you experienced when you were there during the war. You mentioned you've written 2 books, and
Hmm.
I have not read your books, but I've read about your books. Um, what I'd like to do is, number one, have you tell us about your books, your first book, what the title is, and what it's about. The same for the second. And what we'll do is down below in the show notes of this podcast, we'll put links to your books.
Okay, thank you. My first book was published in 2015, and it's called Vietnam Nurse Mending and Remembering.
Mm.
It's basically a memoir of my year in Vietnam. I kept a journal the year that I was there, and took lots and lots of photos. And it has both um, text and photos in that book. The second book was published in 2022. And as I said, it's called Unsteady as She Goes, Battling Parkinson's After Vietnam. And it's about my life for 20 years with Parkinson's. And there's humor in both the books. There's sadness in both the books. So it's as realistic as I could make it.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I love to read. So those are on, I tell you, those are on my to-do list. So I appreciate you
Good.
mentioning those. We'll put those, like I said, in the show notes. And, so thank you. And it's no easy task to sit down and write a book. So the fact that you've written two is incredible.
Thank you. It does take a while, but you just have to do it.
A little bit at a time,
Yes.
at a time. Okay, so we're going to wrap this up here. But before we do, is there anything you'd like to say or share with us before we end the episode?
I think you have frozen.
Oh, how about now?
Okay.
Gotcha. Did you hear that last question? I'm not sure if it went through.
No, I did not hear.
Okay, so we'll edit this out here.
Okay.
But we're going to wrap it up. Is there anything that before we wrap up this episode that you would like to say or share with us?
I'd say the main thing is, yes, women did serve in Vietnam. I still occasionally get people who said, I just didn't think there were nurses in Vietnam. Well, there were hospitals. So if you kind of put two and two together, you can probably figure that out. So we're trying our best to let it be known that there were women in Vietnam. There are 8 women whose names are on the wall. All of them were nurses. And one, Sharon Lane, was killed by direct enemy fire at my hospital 4 months before I arrived. So when I go back to DC, I always do a rubbing of her name on the wall. So women definitely did serve. And the other thing I would throw out, because of the age that we are in right now, please don't put down veterans. I don't understand it. You can't say you support veterans and then call them names and POWs especially. That last tour I did in 2014, there were 2 POWs in our group of 12, and they had each spent 6.5 years in the Hanoi Hilton, which was a prison in Hanoi that several of POWs were housed in. Very difficult quarters. Horribly. I'm not sure I could have survived it. John McCain was, of course, probably the best known of them. But to speak ill of POWs just sickens me. And I would hope that everybody not just supports veterans, but treats them properly. And that's my real goal. That and making everyone aware of the fact that women did serve.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. So thank you for sharing that, number one. But also that's one of the main reasons for this podcast is to give first responders as well as veterans a platform to talk, to share their stories. And so, people can understand what they went through, what they're going through, and appreciate their service. So as I said, I couldn't agree more. So thank you for sharing that.
And thank you.
Yes. Well, we're going to wrap up here, but Lou, before we go, I just want to say that I appreciate you taking the time to be our guest on the Behind the Line podcast. I want to thank you for your military service and for sharing your experiences as an Army nurse while in Vietnam. Thank you very much. And I will say, you truly are an angel of mercy. Thank you and welcome home.
Thank you very much, Tim. It's been a delight.